Cyril Ramaphosa announced a 500 billion rand support package for South Africa to deal with the economic effects of the COVID-19. It's phase 2 of the economic interventions that government has announced. Ramaphosa's economic advisor, Trudi Makhaya, joins me on the line. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. So this 500 billion rand, it comprises of, among other things, 130 billion rand that's reprioritized from our current budget. Can you tell us where else it's coming from?
Thanks, Nzinga, and afternoon to your listeners. So, the National Treasury is going to look at all the possible options to ensure that we have a compelling response to COVID-19. The finances, as you already mentioned, some of the funding will come from reprioritization, and that will be confirmed and further detail given in the budget. Other sources of financing would be from the international financial institutions. I think you played that clip where the president mentioned some of them, including the BRICS Bank, IMF, and World Bank. I think the idea there is that, as South Africa, as the continent, we've been advocating very hard in the global platforms that we have that this is a global pandemic. None of our countries should be expected to shoulder this crisis on our own, and that the international community should come to the party and help us to have a global solution to this. Now, of course, the best channel for the international community to channel those resources is through the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Mm-hmm. That funding is not going to come with onerous conditions. The kind of conditions that you would have seen in the past historically, because there's a recognition that this funding is to deal with a crisis not of our making. And so it will be concessional, the interest rate will be reasonable, and the terms and conditions would also be in line with the crisis mode that we're in.
So there was that concern, and I'm glad you've raised it, about the particular IMF. Let's talk about that 500 billion rands, about 10% of our GDP, which means our government debt, which was set before this crisis to top 70% by the end of 2020, is going to grow. What measures, if any, are in place to try and reduce or mitigate that and cope with our debt in the future?
Yeah. So, on the first instance, the budget will be very clear and will give estimates, the updated budget on where we think that debt to GDP ratio is going to go to. But we're in a crisis, so I think it's all understood that countries have to do what they have to do to ensure their people's livelihoods. In terms of long term, the president also spoke to the third phase of the economic measures that would be announced. And I think there's really one argument that could be made, and that is we have to get the growth rate going in the long term to ensure that we're able to repay our debt, and also that as our debt as a proportion of GDP is reasonable. Taking the measures to mitigate against COVID at least ensures that we don't have a complete economic catastrophe. Mm-hmm. So we secure the economy that we have now. And then the next step would be to think about how do we get an economy of the future that is inclusive, but that also generates growth. And within that, debt would have to be controlled.
Okay. So
it's an ongoing process in terms of the unrolling of these economic measures. But the third phase will definitely talk strongly to that concern that we don't want to have an over-indebted state, and that in the long run, we will get on top of that debt pile and we will be able to get reasonable metrics. But that can't be our obsession when we're in the middle of a crisis.
So we've spoken about the fact that there's going to be funding from international sources. There was a call recently after sessions organized by the UN's Economic Commission for Africa by finance ministers on the continent for an alleviation of debt for the whole continent, so there's greater capacity to deal with COVID-19 and what happens afterwards. How feasible is that suggestion? Is South Africa part of that call, and how would that alleviate South Africa and the rest of the continent's concerns about what happens after the pandemic?
Thanks. Yes, it's a call by the whole continent to say we would need for a debt standstill. So those repayments that were due in the next year to be held in abeyance, they will be paid. So this is not undermining investor confidence, but it's only saying that for the period that we're dealing with COVID, we would want some waiver during that time. Now, some countries have already given concessions to lower income countries on the continent and given them some time, at least 6 months, not to have to repay. But we're arguing that that should be deeper, that should be a bit longer, and that should also deal with the emerging countries on the continent. It's not only the low-income countries that are suffering, but even middle-income countries like us, like Kenya, like Nigeria, and others would also benefit from some measure of debt relief. But it's understood that it would be in the short term, and in the long run, that debt would be repaid. Okay.
Are we able to yet quantify the economic losses that are going to come directly and indirectly from COVID-19?
We have. So I think the Treasury's budget will deal with that to some extent. So there's different scenarios that have been painted. You know the Reserve Bank already in the MPC statement had estimated, I think, about minus 6% growth. So a contraction for 2020. There are other estimates that many economists have come up with. Treasury will also have their own. So we've seen the vast array of scenarios. And the key guiding principles for policy is to ensure that we don't hit the worst case scenario. So, we don't have a health catastrophe, so we manage the spread of the virus carefully, and also that we don't have an economic catastrophe, which is why tomorrow the President will give detail on how we reopen the economy. Okay. So we're going to try and minimize the damage, and then also try to channel funding to make sure that it's not the severe scenario that we face. But we'll keep watching and see how the metrics turn. So I don't think it's necessary to focus on one.
Can you just increase the voice a bit low?
I was just saying it's not necessarily important to focus on one particular estimate in terms of economic growth, but simply to say there are various, and we'll make sure that we minimize the damage through containing the spread of the virus, but also through the economic relief measures.
So we know that over 50 billion rand is going to households through grants. There have been concerns about corruption in the administration of that, especially with the CPS issue still at the back of our minds, and also concerns that reprioritized funding to deal with COVID may mean that issues in municipalities or infrastructure are going to get put on the back burner.
Okay, so two issues. I think on corruption, the President was also very clear that is being watched very carefully to ensure that systems are not rigged, that, funds go to beneficiaries as intended. It will be done through credible channels. So we're using, government institutions, SASSA, UIF, the Revenue Service will also come into play where that's appropriate. And we know the challenges those institutions have had in the past, but there's clearly a lot of scrutiny to ensure that that past is not revisited. So I think from that perspective, corruption will have to be watched very carefully and uprooted. And already there have been instances where officials have been hauled over the coals, where there've been difficulties. I think, I think there's appreciation that is a concern.
And in terms of perhaps reprioritization jeopardizing infrastructure projects and other projects, what's that?
Sure. There's certain kinds of projects that, by virtue of a lockdown and government programs that have not happened, government travel is not happening. Various processes have been suspended. So they're almost automatic savings that come from that can be reprioritized. Okay. When the President announces the third phase of recovery, and he's also already hinted to this, that infrastructure will be a big part of that recovery. Mm-hmm. Infrastructure in terms of health systems infrastructure, but also generally having a credible pipeline of infrastructure projects for the country to roll out. Now, even before COVID, it was clear that the approach that has been taken with infrastructure is to use government resources to leverage private sector resources. So it's not that, you have to look at the amounts that are in the budget to see the full extent of infrastructure spending, precisely because there's been lots of work that's been happening in the background. You would have seen the president also meeting with the development banks and the banking institutions and asset managers not long ago to try and see how they can contribute to infrastructure development. So I wouldn't say that the money in the budget is the full story when it comes to infrastructure. That money is going to be multiplied by bringing in private sector partners.
Trudi Makhaya, President Cyril Ramaphosa's economic advisor, thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon, helping us understand some of that 500 billion rand relief package announced last night by the president and what's going to happen with that.